Good morning, everyone. I'm Lauren Gardner. I'm one of Politico's FDA reporters, and I'm very excited to be sitting here this morning with Dr. Scott Gottlieb, former FDA commissioner during President Trump's first term. And we've got a lot to talk about the president's second term and some of his decisions thus far on health policy and personnel. So let's get right to the big news that broke yesterday. HHS, thousands of workers received reduction in force notices. You posted on X yesterday that 25 years ago, the notion was that Europe was ahead of us on biopharmaceutical innovation and that we lagged and that we made policy decisions that flipped that around. How do you think the cuts that were announced yesterday are going to affect that?
Well, look, I think they're going to be deeply impactful. I think that there was a lot of cuts made to components of the review process that maybe the people who were doing the reductions didn't fully realize what role they played in actual drug review. It seems that anything that had the word policy in it as an office was eliminated. And, perhaps there was a proliferation of the title of policy. People like to hold a policy title in the federal government, but there were a lot of offices within the review divisions, within the Office of Generic Drugs and Office of New Drugs that ostensibly were called policies. So there was a distinct office of policy within each of those groups. But what they did was help adjudicate cross-cutting scientific issues that transcended different drug reviews. So if you had an endpoint that was used in multiple clinical trials and you had to make a determination about the comparability of the results across different drug reviews, or if you had a side effect associated with one drug and you wanted to make a determination whether or not it was a class side effect or specific to a particular molecule, that office made those adjudications, did that evaluation. So without that function, they touched literally every drug review. Now, this is just one example of the offices that were eliminated that I think are going to directly impact drug reviews. And getting back to your original premise, I started there in the early 2000s. It's been a while with Mark McClellan. And we were under a lot of pressure at the time because there was a lot of literature coming out showing that breakthrough therapies were reaching Europeans years before they were available in the United States, particularly more targeted cancer therapies. And so there were decades of efforts by Congress to pass the Cures Act and the FDA Modernization Act and the Food and Drug Administration Amendments Act and the Orphan Drug Act, all this legislation to try to accelerate particularly breakthrough innovation to American consumers more quickly. And it was successful by and large. We really lead the world in approvals of cell and gene therapies and all these novel platforms. And I think that's going to be at risk right now. Just final point, harkening back to, my experience in the first administration. Remember, President Trump was the one who championed the Right to Try Act. He believed in the power of pharmaceutical innovation, and particularly these new paradigms to transform people's lives. So I don't know that this is consistent with his ethos about how innovation can impact patients.
Before we drill down more into some of the specifics you brought up, who do you think is making these decisions on these cuts? Is this DOJ? Is this Secretary Kennedy? How much do you think the new commissioner, Marty McCary, was involved?
Yeah, well, what I was told was that I think the directive to make the reductions came from DOJ, and certainly Secretary Kennedy was involved in that decision. I think the actual adjudication of it, from what I understand, was done with a very small group inside FDA. And the center directors weren't consulted. And so the center directors are in a position to know what the components are that would impact review function, what would impact core function. And so to make reductions in the review process without directly engaging them, remember, we had to do RIF planning when I was there. There were various points when there was a directive from OMB that you were going to have to reduce 1,000 people, 2,000 people. So we had those plans. And we worked closely with the center leadership to try to do it, to try to plan in a way that we wouldn't impact sort of core public health functions. And it was hard, but you could do it. Every agency, there's ways to eliminate positions. I don't believe that was done in this case. I mean, I think you know the same thing from your reporting. This was a very small group of mostly political leadership inside the Office of the Commissioner. And that's why I think you see some of these things like, policy eliminated everywhere across the agency, but not all of it was really a policy function.
So you were talking about the kind of universe of staffers who orbit, let's say, the reviewers. And, before the cuts were formally announced, the HHS was saying the review processes for drugs and devices, like the reviewers will not be touched. So Can you drill down a little bit more specifically for us? What does it mean if a reviewer does not have the pharmacists or the biostatisticians or the other folks around them helping to support the review process? What does it mean if there's an application on their desk for a new cell or gene therapy?
Yeah, so the biostatisticians and the pharmacists would be part of the review process too. But let me give you sort of an example with the generic drugs. When we were trying to create new incentives and new avenues to genericize complex drugs, for example. So we brought the first generic EpiPen to the market. That was a big issue back when I was there, where you had to come up with a way to be able to genericize a drug device delivery system where there was IP, patent protection around the device itself, and there was very specific instructions for use that made it hard to write a generic label to it. So the company had patented the device but not the drug. So we had to come up with a policy formulation for how reviewers can approve a generic version of that product by basically carving around the intellectual property on the device itself. And what we said was, well, as long as a consumer can go from one device to the other, even if they don't have exactly the same instructions for use, as long as they can pick it up and you can demonstrate through what's called an actual use study that they can go from one device to the other and not get confused, we can approve the generic version even if it's not exactly the same device. And lo and behold, we were able to get these generics onto the market. That is the kind of policy formulation work that happens within the division, that without that policy formulation work, you can't make those generic approvals. And that's one example. That happens literally every week. For every generic approval that's a complex drug, of which most of the high-value generic opportunities are complex drugs, you need that policy formulation to give the instructions to the reviewers how to do it. And you need to be able to issue what we call good review management practices that basically is a recipe for what reviewers should do, what rules they should follow when they're reviewing applications, particularly in areas of novel technology or breaking new ground like a novel generic approval. That apparatus is what's gone. So that is going to have a very tangible effect on some of the areas of both new technology but also novelty, wherever there's novelty. So things, approving a statin is not going to be difficult for the agency, right? They know how to do that. But trying to genericize a complex formulation where there's no precedent, that's where they're going to have their hands tied now.
What about inspections? That's another major role that the FDA plays, inspecting facilities that make these drug products, both here and abroad.
Well, look, when you talk to the folks around DOJ, I think they were very clear that they didn't want the review and the inspectional functions to be impacted. Now, that's a directive coming from people who are very far removed from the actual review process. I think on the implementation, if the implementation isn't done in a very thoughtful way, where you're actively engaging the professional staff that understand this, you're going to impact inspectional functions because to send an inspector out into the field, someone's got to book their travel. You've got to get the clearances, so the international office gets the clearances, make sure there's security on site, and if there's not, we provide for it. Someone's got to process their credit cards. People bill their travel on their personal credit cards, and they don't want to go out into the field if they're going to accrue a big credit card bill. All these things need to get thought through. We were active. I know these issues because during the government shutdown, we were actively adjudicating all these issues because my inspectors were there, but all the support staff wasn't there, and I was still trying to get them out into the field to do inspections. So there's a lot of these very detailed issues where there's 2 or 3 or 4 FTEs standing behind a reviewer or an inspector every time they're performing a critical function.
So given all of these trickle-down impacts that you're outlining for us, do you think, was it a mistake for Senate Republicans to confirm Secretary Kennedy, in your view?
Well, look, I certainly expressed my opinion about the Secretary, and it wasn't focused on these kinds of issues. I mean, I think we knew these kinds of issues were going to come up related to their effort to downsize the government, and in the question of how thoughtfully do you do that and how gradually do you do it. My concerns, as you know, primarily turned on his position around vaccines, and my concern, which I think has been borne out, that he would interfere very directly in the vaccine approval process, which I think we're going to unfortunately see, but also in terms of the infrastructure that we rely on in this country to get children vaccinated for things like polio and diphtheria and measles, mumps, and rubella, and I think we're seeing that as well. The one really, look, he canceled the FDA advisory committee that made decisions around the selection of the new strain for the flu vaccine. They've canceled grants on new vaccine production. We've seen him take down front-facing pages of the CDC website that encourage people to get vaccinated. And probably the most tangible step that we've seen in recent weeks was during what is the biggest flu epidemic that we've had in 20 years in the United States, they took down a campaign that was encouraging people to go out and get vaccinated for flu. So that is a very deliberate step in the setting of, a public health crisis with respect to the flu. Now we see offices getting closed that are going to vaccinate people in West Texas for measles. There's probably thousands of cases of measles in West Texas right now. There's vast underreporting when you talk to people on the ground. So, these are all very tangible things, because I think his career has been dedicated to these sort of anti-vax efforts. I don't think he's made a mystery about it. I don't think we should be surprised. He's been very clear. You can't fault him for not being very clear about his intentions here. I think the people who thought, well, maybe he won't follow through on it, I think they were the ones who probably, maybe have some buyer's remorse. I don't.
And related to that, how do you, given all of this context that you just talked about, and on top of that, the rifts yesterday, how do you anticipate now Commissioner Marty McCary to work within this ecosystem now of dealing with this, the Secretary's position on things like measles and advocating for different treatments, and now doing this in the context of fewer people in government working on some of these issues who have been there for a long time?
I think Marty has got there's going to be some very early tests of whether or not Marty is going to, and Marty's a friend, I think he's very good. I was glad to see the senator make some complimentary remarks about him and also to support him in the Senate. But I do think there's going to be some very early tests, perhaps within days, we have PDUFA dates, that's going to give us an indication of how much he is going to establish independence about the decision-making there, not just on the policy, but on product-specific things related to vaccines, or how much he's going to be pressured by the Secretary to do certain things that are clear evidence of sort of political decision-making in the scientific and review process. We all got it, although I was fortunate. I mean, Alex Azar, in many ways, was exceptional. He understood that it was important to maintain the independence of FDA, and he guarded that. But, I've been in and around FDA for 25 years. There's always secretaries who think that they can get involved in certain decisions, and then, you have to educate them about the importance of maintaining that firewall and the independence, because it serves them well at other points. I don't see the respect for that right now, and I think we're going to see some really visible tests of that very soon.
Is there a particular bright line?
I think we should just watch the news flow. I'm sure if there's a bright line, I'm going to read about it in Politico.
That's true. So I do have to bring up, you were name-checked a little bit earlier in the program by Kennedy advisor Callie Means. As to sum up, you're a part of a medical establishment. You're on the board of a pharmaceutical company, and you're raising alarms about things like measles, and the suggestion is that this is all done while ignoring chronic diseases that afflict many Americans. Can you address the general belief that there's some kind of tension between dealing with infectious disease issues and chronic disease issues?
Look, I can address it very simply that a lot of chronic diseases are a manifestation of infectious disease. I mean, we look at all the emerging data. I had a B-cell lymphoma that when they sequenced it, it had Epstein-Barr virus in it. And if I had never gotten Epstein-Barr virus, I would never have gotten cancer. And now there's links between Epstein-Barr virus and multiple sclerosis, where I think the data is very convincing. So I think a lot of chronic debilitating disease, autoimmune disease, have infectious disease origins. Look, I think that the Secretary's tapped into a lot of concern among consumers that general health isn't good in this country, that diet has a very important nexus to our health, and that healthful opportunities, especially eating opportunities, aren't available to every consumer. Not everyone can go shop at Whole Foods. And, we have competed in this country, food companies compete on portion size and taste and packaging and not the healthfulness of their foods, largely because they can't make qualified health claims on food labels. I think there's a lot we can do to improve that. I think it requires a lot of complex policymaking, which I haven't really seen evidence of yet. But I do worry that a lot of the anti-vax sentiment, or a lot of this kind of movement, is really an anti-vax movement, and some of the MAHA stuff, for some people, is just the wrapping around what is really a much more deliberate anti-vax campaign. And the evidence of that, to me, is when you have people like the person who name-checked me this morning, who goes out and talks about some of these things around food and that are more kind of like MAHA related, however you define that. He gets attacked by the anti-vaxxers that he's not being anti-vax enough. So I think, like, you know, the fellow travelers are taking heat from the anti-vaxxers because they're adhering to the MAHA part of the agenda, not the anti-vax part of the agenda. So that's very revealing to me. I think this is a much broader anti-vax movement with a lot of other things wrapped around it. And unfortunately, that may leave some consumers who believe in the other components of this agenda disappointed.
I'm running out of time, so one final...
You're out of time.
Don't tell them. Don't tell them. It's ratting me out here. One quick final question. You commented on Dr. Peter Marks' resignation at the end of last week, but I want to broaden it out a little bit since we've covered that pretty closely. What is your response to the critics who say that the secretary should have the bandwidth to make staffing changes within the department and further down into the agencies that he sees fit to carry out his agenda? What is this?
Yeah, look, the secretary does have broad authority. There's no question about that. I think a lot of secretaries for 20, 30 years have respected maintaining a degree of independence of the agency because it served them well. Even if there were things they wanted to do, they knew crossing that line would come back to haunt them in certain ways, because when they wanted to separate themselves from an FDA decision, then they wouldn't be able to. Now they own the whole thing. You know, Peter was an exceptional leader. You think back to the early 2000s when I got there, we didn't even have a cell and gene therapy group. In a decade, Peter really presided over the creation of that modern industry. There's 2,000 cell and gene therapies in development right now, 35 in phase 3 trials, 300 in phase 1 clinical trials. They're transforming patients' lives. I will tell you personally, we approved the first gene therapy when I was there. I remember briefing the president on it and how enthused he was about the drug Kymriah, the CAR-T drug that transformed the lives of patients with ALL. That approval would not have happened on time without Peter's involvement. That was a very sort of bespoke regulatory process in many ways, where a lot of the senior leaders were involved in those reviews because it was such novel technology. And I do worry, more than anything else, I worry about the impacts on that group in particular, because it's not just Peter. They took out the senior leadership of that entire group and some very good people. Meyer, who ran the policy shop, again, not a policy shop, it did review functions. The head, Janekis, who was head of regulatory operations in that group and kept all the trains running on time. I think that segment, we really need to go back and re-adjudicate what they did with respect to those reductions, because that's going to have a very tangible impact on patients whose lives can literally be transformed with a gene therapy that could, you know, end a debilitating inherited disease like sickle cell disease.
All right, and we'll leave it there. Thank you so much, Dr. Gottlieb, for joining us.